Yeah, let's lock in. Let's lock in. Next video. The closest thing to hell in the USA. This might be a dark video. I'm just letting you know.
Before the Civil War started. About a decade before the Civil War started, a different transformation was occurring in the social fabric of America, one pertaining to the world of psychiatry. Before the 1850s, individuals who were considered to be mentally unfit to participate in mainstream society were—
Bro, they literally closed them in a fucking room. Like, early mental hospitals was like just a torture chamber. Like, they have pictures of like poop on the walls, and they would just fucking basically like throw you in a big hospital and just give you food so you didn't die.
Often left destitute on the absolute fringes of it. They routinely lived out their lives in jails, poorhouses, and other such institutions that weren't designed with the idea of care or any sort of rehabilitation. This was a problem that Dorothea Dix fought hard to change. Dix had spent some of her younger years as a teacher, but after inheriting a fortune from a wealthy grandparent, she instead shifted her life's focus towards humanitarianism. She'd take a trip to the UK, where she would make a circle of friends who were all advocating for something called lunacy reform, a movement—
I feel like it was so weird being somebody that was like actually charitable and like humanitarian in like early 1800s or even early 1900s. Like, I always just imagine people in that time being so like just monotone and very immune to any emotion. Like, empathy specifically. Not like everybody was a sociopath or narcissist, but it was just like, they just didn't care. Because I feel like in that time, it was just like, you just give a fuck about you and your family. Like, you don't got time to be like tweaking about, oh, somebody else is dealing with something.
Intended to better the care of the mentally ill, which would eventually result in publicly run institutions that were solely dedicated to caring for people who were described back in those days as lunatics.
You think you would be that way? I have no idea. It's impossible to tell. Whatever, like, that's like one of the things that I try not to do, but I still do, where it's like, you see somebody do something, you're like, why would they do that? I would never do that. And you're like, you can't say that, you know? You would never do that if you were you. But if you were them, you can't say that, you know? You could be like, I wouldn't do that. But if you were born as them in their time frame, it's like, you might be like them. I'm not saying like, oh, you would be like, you know, Hitler or some, you know, genocidal maniac, right? But like, if you were born in the 1800s, you might not be empathetic. You might just be like a very stern, nothingness person that's just like, I'm just trying to eat and survive, you know?
Dorothea would bring this idea back to the USA. Her efforts would result in a new kind of public institution called insane asylums.
Oh.
These weren't places for patients to receive structured treatment. They were instead designed to provide something called moral therapy. The idea was that a calm environment surrounded by nature, fresh air, and sunlight may be enough to quiet the mind of a disturbed individual. This was the philosophy that the Mississippi State Insane Asylum was built around. Christened in 1855, the institution was built on a plot of land consisting of 140 acres of greenery. A farm was built next to the hospital with the intention of not only providing residents with some light therapeutic outdoor work, but also to make the whole asylum self-sustaining.
In theory, this doesn't sound that bad. Like, giving a more natural approach of like, okay, you could be in a happier, like warmer climate where you have maybe minimal tasks, but you're able to kind of just live out your life.
By the time Dorothea Dix had passed away in 1887, the Mississippi State Insane Asylum was housing around 500 patients. By all accounts, her vision had panned out. People suffering from all manner of mental illness and disorders now had a place to go instead of being relegated to a life of imprisonment or homelessness. Fast forward 130 years. It's now 2012, and a construction crew is preparing to build a road on some of the land once owned by the now long defunct asylum.
Oh no. They're gonna be digging up bodies.
The work had to stop though, as just 1 foot below the surface, a worker digging would discover a single pine coffin. A group of archaeologists are called in, and a detailed excavation of the area
That does not look big enough to hold a human. Am I fucking crazy? His hand alone is like as wide as the coffin is
carried out, revealing 65 more identical coffins, all containing human remains. It's not terribly surprising that people died and were buried in a place that was designed for them to live out their entire lives. But still, this had been a public institution, and these graves weren't recorded anywhere. The world of insane asylums had been one of secrecy, and the internal history of these places mostly occurred behind closed doors, far away from the public eye. So a geophysical survey of the entire plot of land once owned by the hospital would be carried out a year later in 2013, just in the off chance there were more bodies spread out around the large slice of Earth. After the survey concluded, it would indeed result in the discovery of more bodies. Not just 1 or 2, or 10, or 100, or
What?
1,000. In total, up to 7,000 bodies were discovered buried in about 20 acres of land.
How many people even went to this insane asylum, though? They said there was 500 people when this woman died that created it. There was 7,000 bodies buried like a foot underground.
This was enough to draw national
How did none of them wash up in that time frame through like a storm or something?
attention.
If they weren't even buried deep.
People are stunned at the sheer volume of corpses this asylum had produced in only about 80 years. Authorities would begin exhuming the bodies for further examination. The coffins they were found in were very small and narrow, with many corpses having to be bent in awkward ways to be able to fit inside them. While the remains were nothing more than skeletons at this point, a surprising amount of information could still be garnered to flesh out these individuals.
I feel like they had to be malnourished, no? Even if you were stuffing a body in there, bro, like you are not stuffing my ass in that. Like I'm not fitting in that shit unless I haven't eaten in like a month.
Stories. Age, sex, height, ancestry, these could all be determined just from the bones, as well as evidence of past trauma. This is where things get even darker. These skeletons were full of huge dents, breaks, fractures, and segments that were soft and deformed as a result of extreme nutritional deficiencies. These people didn't simply pass away peacefully as a result of natural causes. They suffered grave mistreatment, which almost certainly contributed to their deaths. Look,
and I know it was probably a wide range of people that went to these asylums, but a lot of the time it would be somebody that was just like mildly neurotypical. Or not neurotypical. Neurodivergent. Somebody that was mildly neurodivergent would be like at one of these asylums. Like,
tell you the whole story of this asylum. I was started out with a noble mission that soon soured.
And they were just like, we can't fix you.
As a result of overcrowding, mismanagement, and a lack of understanding of mental health and psychology in general. I could tell you about the countless records of patients who were damned to this awful decrepit place, who weren't even mentally ill at all, and were simply sent there because somebody complained about them to the state, and that was enough to get them sent away for life. The problem is, the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum is just so typical. This isn't a special place. There are hundreds of these mental hospitals like this spread out around every corner of the USA.
With that many bodies buried around their grounds?
And they all had similar track records.
Oh, God.
Back in those days, people often didn't know what was happening in these places. Individuals who were mentally ill, suffering from neurological disorders, or people who just simply didn't conform to the strict cultural standards of the time were sent to these institutions to be forgotten. It wasn't just that
Yeah, it's wild. It wasn't just, I feel like so many people are like, oh, well, an insane asylum probably had, like, insane people. Like, 90% of the people that were there, weren't, like, clinically insane in, like, today's terms. They were just, like, different.
Were secretive and hiding atrocities behind closed doors, but the people of the time also just weren't really paying much attention. Today, though, we know exactly the horrible things that were happening in these little slices of hell. And in this video, we're going to talk about some particularly dark examples. I gotta warn you, what lays ahead of us is extremely disturbing, unusually so for this channel. If you're somebody who's easily upset, especially when vulnerable people face grave mistreatment, you may want to watch one of my other videos. Abandon all hope, all ye who enter here. On
Yo, how dark is this fucking video gonna get?
cold September day in 1887,
Bro, to give me a 2-minute warning.
the same year Dorothea Dix died, as the Mississippi State Asylum was rapidly deteriorating, a woman is being led into a different mental hospital. This one isn't in the South, it's in New York. Blackwell Island Insane Asylum. This institution had been running since 1839. The idea behind it resembled that of its Mississippi counterpart. It was situated on Blackwell Island in the East River, a then quiet strip of mostly undeveloped land. It was intended to be a calm, therapeutic environment, but just like in Mississippi, overcrowding and neglect would swiftly ruin that mission. The facility was designed to house around 200 patients, but by 1870, it was home to 1,300.
Wow.
They'd attempt to solve the overcrowding problem by removing all the men, making the hospital women only. But that only removed about
That's gotta be a problem.
25% of patients, as women were disproportionately overrepresented in these asylums.
Wait, they removed all men and only a fourth of the people ended up leaving?
New York City in this era was
Yeah, that shit's fucked. Because there's probably so many instances. I guarantee there are instances of, like, unhappy husbands that were just like, my wife's insane. And then they fucking send her away. Because it was like women had literally no rights. So you would just be like, oh, really? Yeah. And then they just took her.
being strained from an influx of new immigrants from the old world, and they were hard up for cash as a result. To save money, the city would use convicts from a nearby prison to act as nurses and attendants.
Oh, what a great idea.
Being strained from an influx of new immigrants from the old world, and they were hard up for cash as a result. To save money, the city would use convicts from a nearby prison to act as nurses.
Male prison convicts being sent to be carers towards potentially, mentally disabled women. Oh, wow.
And attendants to the
What could go wrong?
patients in Blackwell. Instead of hiring doctors, they would hire students that were still in medical school. This was the facility Nellie Brown was now being led into. She was previously housed in a women's shelter, but staff had her committed after other residents complained about her acting erratically. In less than 48 hours, Nellie had gone from the women's shelter to standing in front of a judge at a courtroom to seeing a doctor for a physical examination to walking in the front doors of Blackwell. However, the moment she passed through that threshold, Nellie seemed to change. Her 1,000-yard stare vanished and her incoherent babble ceased. There's a good reason for that.
Yo, was she fucking faking it? No way.
Nellie is not crazy. In fact, this was all planned. Nellie Brown was actually Nellie Bly, an investigative reporter working for the New York World. She had
What? So she got in on purpose so she could see the conditions of the asylum.
spent weeks practicing and planning a strategy to get sent to Blackwell as a patient. Her intention was
That's so risky.
to report on the conditions from the inside from the perspective of a patient. Dropping the act wasn't part of the plan though. She had only done that because of how shocked she was at the truly vile conditions of the Blackwell Insane Asylum right after walking through the front door. She had known it would be bad. That was the whole reason Joseph Pulitzer had sent her on this assignment. There were stirrings in New York surrounding the deteriorating
Pulitzer from like the Pulitzer Prize?
conditions at Blackwell, but these facilities tended to be secretive, and the true scope of the horrors weren't publicly known. After removing all the men in 1870, the hospital had recorded 900 patients, more than 4 times its maximum occupancy. But when Nellie arrived 17 years later, it was housing 1,600. Continual budget cuts had left only 16 medical professionals on staff, approximately 1 for every 100 patients.
And it's so sucky too, because even if you are a woman, like say you're one of these people working there, and you actually care about the people, you're just so understaffed that no matter how good you do your job, they're still living in shitty conditions. Because you're underfunded, and it's the same thing with, like, teachers having to, like, be one teacher to, like, 50 students, and they're getting overcrowded so that a lot of the kids don't learn as well, and they can't give, like, hands-on assistance. It's like that times 12, because you're dealing with people that may have extreme disabilities that you have to care for, and you're dealing with one person to 100 people.
As Nellie was ingested into the system, she was only given a thin cotton flannel slip for clothing. The building was incredibly cold. All the windows were kept open year-round, regardless of the outside temperature. Some patients were given thin, moth-eaten shawls as a reward for good behavior, and these were considered a coveted item among the population at Blackwell. Nellie was told to sit on a bench beside a few other patients. This was a single daily activity at the asylum, sitting motionless for up to 12 hours at a time.
Wow. Just literally rotting.
Moving or speaking to fellow patients is strictly forbidden. At the end of the day, she's led to a straw-stuffed pallet with an oilcloth cover. This is her bed. Even if she could get comfortable, she wouldn't get much sleep anyways. Multiple orderlies would regularly make the rounds, counting out patients loud enough that there were barely ever any truly quiet moments during the night. The next morning, she's brought to an area to eat some breakfast. Rats are weaving their way between her and her fellow patients' feet. Garbage is piling up everywhere. Once again, Bly spends her day sitting motionless on a hard wooden bench, squished between other patients. Some residents wouldn't sit still, so the nurses would tie them up with ropes.
What?
Sometimes, though, they wouldn't stop there. Bly would experience the nurses, whom I will remind you are mostly convicts that were living out sentences at a nearby prison, acting sadistically towards patients on multiple occasions. A resident named Mrs. Grady would start chattering to herself, which would prompt a nearby nurse to throw her down and drag her across the floor by her hair. Another unnamed patient was sat upon and throttled by a nurse who noticed her crying. Sometimes the brutality was completely unprompted. For no apparent reason, a nurse would begin hitting a patient known as Mrs. Cotter with a broom handle. He'd then start pulling out her hair by the fistfuls. Occasionally, a doctor would walk by, and the patients would all begin complaining about the mistreatment, only to have it all dismissed as delusions. Perhaps the most
Wow, that actually pisses me off so much.
disturbing thing Nellie saw was the mental states of her fellow patients. While some of them were indeed suffering from different forms of debilitating mental illness or neurological disorders, many weren't. A large amount of the patients Bly interacted with on a day.
Yeah, but they can't resist, because if they do, then they're literally in prison. Because it's like, if you resist and you try and fight back, you're just going to be in an even shittier situation than you were previously. So you're just kind of forced to just watch it happen and be like, oh, that sucks.
Daily basis were completely sane. They had been sent to Blackwell for a number of unjust reasons. One patient had been sent there after her husband reported her to the state for supposedly taking an interest in other men.
Yo, I literally was just saying that's exactly what the fuck would happen. I guarantee you half the women here were just from, like, dickhead husbands that were just like, my wife won't have sex with me. Oh, well, something must be wrong. Let's send her to Blackwell.
Another had been sent there after merely collapsing from overwork one day at her job. Many others were immigrants that didn't speak any English. They were sent to Blackwell because they were unable to communicate during their court hearings and physical examinations, so they were sent to an insane asylum to live out the rest of their life. Possibly even more disturbing, however, was how the staff treated Nellie herself.
I would be worried if I was Nellie, I wouldn't be able to get out. But I'm assuming there would be like a news reporter that'd be like, we sent this woman in, you have to give us to her.
She had stopped pretending to be crazy the moment she walked into the
give her to us.
Asylum. Yet, nobody who worked there seemed to notice. They still treated her as if she was a lunatic. They would start pointing out her normal, everyday quirks as evidence of her insanity. She would eventually start making pleas to be released, but these would not only go unanswered, but they would be put into her record as symptoms of her madness. It would take her newspaper getting involved to actually get her released, which would happen 10 days after she was initially committed. Nellie had documented everything
She saw all that shit within 10 days? I thought she was living there for like 6 months.
that happened to her while she was on the inside, and she'd put it all together in the form of multiple long-form articles that would eventually be turned into a book called 10 Days in a Madhouse. The case would instantly explode. This was a detailed peek into an overlooked and secretive world, and people were shocked at how bad things really were. A grand jury would be convened to investigate the conditions at the asylum, and though the staff at Blackwell made a last-ditch effort to clean the place up before the investigators
Oh my god, scrambling. Just firing all the fucking nurses that were just like torturing them.
visited, who were immediately told that everything Nellie had wrote were lies, the jury ultimately sided with Bly. The staff members who had been mistreating patients were all fired, and multiple budget increases and new regulations were penned in an effort to improve conditions in all of New York's public facilities, much to the satisfaction of Nellie Bly, who would go on to become one of the most influential journalists of her
Hopper, thank you for the raid, bro. Joss Ducks, Coaster, AMD, and VME for the sub. 23 in Blake, Cupid, Ange, and Men for the sub. Cassie, Crispo for the sub. Dane, Rusty, Loopy, Mr. Peanut for the sub, Josh for the 5, TD for the sub, Mr. Sade, thank you for the 3 again.
Per day, inspiring many other women to get into journalism and in turn creating an entire genre of women-led investigative reporting. Nellie Bly's investigation into Blackwell may have been the first peek we've gotten behind the walls of a typical insane asylum, but it wouldn't be the last. More information about other such institutions would come out.
How do such bad nurses even get the job even nowadays? Short staffing.
In the decades that followed, some contemporary for their time, but many would only surface years.
If you need an employee and you have such a demand for employees but a little supply, you start reaching out to people that are worse. You're just understaffed, so you need not anyone, but you need people.
Later, as a result of some investigation that unearths previously forgotten about records and documents that all detail horrible things. Despite the horrors that Nellie Bly brought to the public eye, conditions would still continue to be unbelievably inhumane at the many insane asylums that existed around the USA. And in fact, the people in charge of these establishments would begin to introduce new elements that would drag down the lives of their patients to new and terrifying lows. Hey, have you ever wanted to replace your doom-scrolling time with something more productive for sponsoring this video? A revolution happened shaking up the world of science. Germ theory. While previously...
Bro, this is what I was talking about, dude. They just wouldn't clean the place. They wouldn't clean the people either. They just don't get a bath. You just start there's just shit everywhere.
All disease and illnesses were thought to be caused by the imbalance of the body's internal humors and bad air. Medical science at the end of the 19th century would replace these causes with viruses and bacteria.
Yeah, I always wonder what living in that time was like, where they genuinely thought that, like, you had an imbalance of, like, blood and bile and all this other, like, what was it? It was, like, piss? Not piss. It was blood, phlegm, and other, what were, like, the bodily fluids? What were the 4 bodily fluids? Not that can transmit HIV. Why is it fucking autofilling that? What were the 4 bodily fluids that they balanced in medieval times? Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. What is yellow bile and black bile? And you had to balance those, and that's how they made you healthy. How was that even popularized? I know it was, like, during, like, Greek... That was, like, old shit. Yeah, Greek physician Galen maintained through the Middle Ages. So it was prior to Middle Ages, but, like, where did they come up with that? I know there was, like, early urology. We were watching a video on that, how people, like, drank piss and shit. But, like, how did they come up with, like, that specifically?
Doctors can now produce vaccines for illnesses that were previously thought to be untreatable. They could also perform surgery much more safely. They could now prescribe a new kind of medication called an antibiotic that would magically treat different infections. These few years at the turn of the 20th century would see the start of the gradual but enormous rise in life expectancy that would take place over the next 100 years. But as revolutionary as germ theory was, it wasn't fully understood right off the bat. And the early years of doctors exploring these new concepts would be rife with pseudoscience.
Oh my god, were they experimenting on people in insane asylums?
One such scientific dead end was something called focal sepsis. This was a theory that suggested bacteria could travel from the site of an infection to other parts of the body through the bloodstream to create new infections.
So they would, like, chop people's body parts off?
Supposedly, these secondary infections could manifest much like the primary one they originated from. But doctors also thought that if bacteria were to enter the brain, it could cause psychiatric symptoms. By the 1910s, it was generally accepted in medical science that infections in unrelated parts of the body may be the cause of various neurological disorders and mental illnesses. One pioneer of this theory was Dr. Henry Cotton, the medical director at the New Jersey State Hospital, an insane asylum that had been founded in 1848. He had come into this position in 1907, and the early years of his tenure were marked with genuine efforts to improve the conditions for the patients living there. He abolished the use of mechanical restraints, improved staff-to-patient ratios, and began requiring workers to convene in daily meetings to discuss patient care.
Well, that's not bad.
It's clear he did genuinely want to improve things for his patients, which makes it a little hard to believe the atrocities that would follow. Dr. Khan had also installed a laboratory in the asylum, complete with a
Yeah, they'd probably start chopping people's legs off.
surgical facility. In 1913, he would set out to use the principles of focal sepsis to find treatments for lunacy and madness. His core hypothesis was that the patients in his asylum may have some unseen infections somewhere on their bodies that were sending bacteria and other toxins to their brains, and that by identifying these infections and then surgically removing them, they could be cured of their madness. He would begin with the teeth. It became routine at the New Jersey State Hospital for patients
To pull teeth out?
to have all their teeth pulled. This wouldn't result in improvements to any patient's condition.
I feel like it would, if anything, worsen your condition because now you're not getting proper nutrients.
But Cotton would justify it by saying the infections had likely spread further into the body and that they simply needed to go deeper. The tonsils would be next on the list. But again, every patient who had their tonsils extracted saw no meaningful change in their condition. He would then deem the sinuses to be the next hiding places of these mystery infections, and patients would begin systematically getting their sinuses drained. Again,
Bro, this is like 100 years ago, man. He was just ripping people's teeth out because he thought that that was why they were sick.
no meaningful improvements. At this point, Dr. Cotton had begun weaving in a new theory into his practice: auto-intoxication. This was the idea that the bacteria present in the intestinal tract could leak out and cause infections, so Cotton would begin surgically removing pieces of his patients' digestive tracts. Stomachs, gallbladders, spleens, all of these would be removed on
Wouldn't they just die if he did that?
many patients residing in the asylum. But the most common procedure by far was the removal of the large intestine. After
How do you remove somebody's large intestine and then they die and then you do it again and they die and then you do it again and they die and you go, yeah, this is probably right.
all, that's where the majority of your gut bacteria resides. During Dr. Khan's tenure at New Jersey State Hospital,
This seems less like, I understand, you know, he like increased patient staffing and he wanted to do all this stuff to like help improve their lives. But it seems more kind of like a precursor to like weird World War II experiments that like the Germans and the Japanese did than like actually trying to help people. This seems more like, hey, we just got like 5,000 people that we could kill and nobody would care. So let's just test some shit.
he would perform a total of 645 colectomies, treating conditions ranging from schizophrenia to mild depression.
Oh, you're feeling a little depressed? Let's take out your large intestine.
What makes the situation even worse was that Dr. Henry Cotton wasn't even a trained surgeon. He was completely self-taught, and he personally carried out every procedure.
Sadly, it needed to happen for humans to learn. That's like the weird thing about human atrocities is like, they're like, God, it's so fucked. The Japanese atrocities they did were horrible. The even worse thing is that the U.S. bought that knowledge from the Japanese. Like, because they learned shit from it. Like, because it's effectively just trial and error. Right? But they're killing every failure. Every error is a death. And they go through 600, 1,000 deaths to even move on to the next fucking trial.
The hospital also didn't have any antibiotics on hand, and these factors would lead to a death rate as high as 45%.
Wow.
Hundreds of patients had died during surgery, and the thousands that did survive were left permanently maimed. Like
And
this
he never went, oh, this is wrong.
18-year-old girl, whom we only know about as a result of her.
How's that worse than less people would die? I'm saying it's worse that the U.S. bought it and then as a means of just like not like a lot of the people in that time were not prosecuted because the U.S. used that information that they learned and gathered. I'm saying there would have been other ways to test it, and it's fucked up. But it's like now the alternative is like animal testing. Usually you do like a lot of more background research, but if they think something will work, instead of performing it on a human, they test on like rats and other shit first.
Cover patient records. She had entered the asylum because of her agitated depression, and over the course of her stay, Dr. Cotton would remove all her teeth
They use plecos now? Well, yeah, plecos are also extremely invasive.
in her tonsils, drain her sinuses, remove her cervix, and cut out a large section of her intestinal tract.
Wow.
These surgeries would result in no improvement to her psychiatric condition, and they would only serve to greatly worsen her physical health. It
What are plecos? Type of fish that you have in a fish tank?
wouldn't be hard to come to the conclusion that Dr. Cotton was simply a sadist, somebody who enjoys hurting other people. But he very likely did genuinely believe in everything he was doing. He would also experiment on his own family, having all the teeth pulled from his wife's and both of his sons' heads. He would also perform a colectomy on his younger son. These procedures
Bro, like, literally, he pulled his entire family's teeth out of them. Like, this guy's just a fucking psychopath. Like,
must have proven to be
I mean, like, there's no way he's just like, oh, yeah, this is working.
unthinkably traumatic, as both of his sons would take their lives. Dr. Khan would die a celebrated and venerated figure in 1933, the true breadth of his atrocities not yet known to the general public. He himself had claimed an 85% success rate for the procedures he performed, even though that was in all likelihood a completely made-up number. The truth wouldn't be publicly known until the 2000s, when sociologist Andrew Scull would begin meticulously reading through patient records, letters, and asylum archives, an effort that would result in his 2005 book, Madhouse, a tragic tale of megalomania in modern medicine. It's worth mentioning that everything Conan did had been performed without the consent of his patients. People who were kept in these asylums did not possess legal competence, and thus doctors were basically free to do whatever they wanted to them without any sort of permission.
And it's not even like, it doesn't make it any better if they were more mentally disabled. But I'm trying to make the point that, like, there were people that were most definitely competent enough to be like, don't do this. And they just went, no, and then just did it anyway. Like, not somebody that's just like, you know, not physically responding.
Patient consent not being considered necessary in this era would lead to many similar atrocities happening all over the United States.
Like, he did this 600 times. There's definitely been multiple instances where he was like, we're going to remove your colon. And they went, don't do that. And he just went, we're going to do it.
Possibly the most unsettling of these human experiments, and undoubtedly the most disturbing thing I've ever read about, is the Willowbrook hepatitis experiments on children. Between 1956 and 1971, researchers led by Dr. Saul Krugman of New York University would start handing out glasses of chocolate milk to the residents of a ward for intellectually disabled children in the Willowbrook State School, one of countless institutions suffering from the same overcrowding and neglect issues we've been talking about throughout this video. These drinks were spiked with hepatitis. Every child who ingested this drink would become severely ill. If I'm being honest, I don't really want to get into the details here. It's just truly vile and awful things happening to the most vulnerable people. It goes a little beyond your average sense of morbid curiosity. Just know that the children of this ward suffered immensely. This experiment was done in an effort to develop a vaccine for hepatitis, but that was unsuccessful, and the ethical failure would directly lead to the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act being penned into law in 1980, which would slowly lead to the dismantling of the asylum system as we've known it throughout this video. Now at this point you might be thinking,
yeah, like, when was the last, like, old age mental hospital destroyed? Like, when did this fully stop? I feel like it was, like, fairly recent in human history. Like, they definitely had, like, fucked up mental hospitals even in, like, the 50s.
Thinking, can it really get any worse?
Maybe not this bad, right? To the extent where they're performing, like, weird experiments, but
those human experiments,
like the 1980s, yeah, I would assume around that time,
while undoubtedly cruel and inhumane, were done under the guise of helping people. Those experiments at Willowbrook, for
Google says the 90s.
example, the idea is comically evil, but the doctor in charge of the program had done a similar experiment a few years earlier that resulted in a new vaccine for measles, which stopped an epidemic in its tracks at the very same asylum, in turn saving hundreds of lives. This next asylum, though, it's hard to find any sort of good intentions behind the atrocities that would occur there. The Philadelphia-based Bybury Asylum opened in 1907 as a sort of rural spillover to lighten the load on the nearby urban asylums that were becoming dangerously overcrowded. It wouldn't take long, however, for Bybury itself to become alarmingly over capacity, as starting in 1913, the city of Philadelphia would start using the institution as its primary location for housing the insane. The campus would expand over the following decades to accommodate the massive influx of people, eventually reaching 50 buildings with a network of underground tunnels that snake between them.
50 fucking buildings? What do they have, like 10,000 people?
Still though, the hospital couldn't keep up with its growing population of patients. By 1947, 6,100 souls called Byberry home, 3,600 more than its rated capacity of 2,500. The staff couldn't keep up either. Byberry was unable to recruit new doctors and nurses quickly enough, so they would eliminate all requirements and background checks in an effort to get more employees onboarded.
Yeah, literally just letting anyone in.
This would result in the majority of staff at Byberry being completely unqualified for their positions, and many workers...
I mean, that's the problem. Like, we have, like, smaller scale issues like that today where there's, like, not enough teachers, so they remove the requirements to become a teacher early, and you could become, like, a pseudo-teacher without the requirements that you need, just as long as you're actively trying to get the requirements while you're teaching. So it's like, I mean, it's not in the same scale, but it's like, we still do the same shit today where it's like, if we need people, we just make it, like, way easier to get the job. Like, you could literally entry level, like, high school education, step in and start doing something as long as you have said and obviously taken the steps to start getting the education required.
Had only taken their jobs because they were desperate and had no other options. Like almost everything else.
They do anything but up pay. I agree, but the defense in that sense is even if you up pay, that doesn't instantly create new people that are going to take those jobs. Everybody that's required already is in that field. It's just like if you up pay, it'll solve the problem 8 years from now, you know?
We've talked about today.
Like, they want it solved now.
Atrocities at Byberry would only come out later as a result of investigative reporting. The methods the untrained workers would use to restrain patients were so cruel that they're a little hard to talk about on YouTube. One of them was called a water cure, which was essentially a combination of waterboarding and neck wringing. It would cause several patients to die. In fact, murder was a regular part of life at Byberry, whether it was staff on patient or patient on patient. There was only one staff member for every 400 residents at the hospital, and as a result, there was little oversight.
Wait, but they had 6,000 people working there, so they only had like 30 employees?
Sometimes a patient would be killed and their body would just be left in the hallway for days before a staff member would happen across it. In one occurrence of this happening, and luckily I won't tell you the brutal manner this particular patient passed away in, but doctors would only discover the killing after other patients were seen playing with her teeth. Possibly the
they destroyed her body?
Most tragic part of this place was the children's ward. Rather than using actual orderlies and nurses to manage this unit, the doctors would instead recruit adult patients to be in charge of it.
Oh, this girl is so malnourished.
I'm sure you can imagine how that worked out. The medical treatments patients had to endure at Byberry somehow may be the worst we've come across today. The doctors had a policy of not offering any sort of pain management or sedation for medical procedures.
Oh my god, so they'd perform surgery and you just feel the pain.
They believed that lunatics did not feel pain. Invasive procedures would be performed on patients who could feel every little horrible thing that was happening to them. It was also commonplace for patients to be tied down with restraints on them for extended periods of time. In 1987, yes, not 27, 87, the Eastern Pennsylvania U.S. District Court would hear the case of William Kirsch, a man who had been held in 4-point restraints for 3 years straight. Imagine all your limbs being
He didn't move for 3 years?
tied down for
He was tied to a bed for 3 fucking years. How did he not get bed sores and die?
3 years. He had multiple broken bones, severe muscle atrophy, and suffered extreme psychological deterioration as a result of his ordeal. 3 years later in 1990, the asylum would close for good. Its entire existence was marred by constant controversy, yet the state just simply didn't have anywhere else to send people for inpatient mental health care, so it persisted through the years as an ugly sore, something that you can't really get rid of. So instead, you just cover it up and hope that nobody comments on it. The same can be said for the whole of the 19th and 20th century mental asylum system. These places were secretive, and they did try desperately to cover up their wrongdoings, but the public leaders who held the power to actually do something about these horrible places usually just left them alone. Scandals would break out and the public would get terribly angry, but then they would just forget about it, and nothing would change.
That's true.
It really does mirror the historical treatment of people with mental illness or neurological disorders. For most of history, these individuals were kept in the shadows. They were seen as an embarrassment or something to be ashamed of, and thus people just weren't interested in how they were being treated. It's nice that things are better now, but it's scary to think that a lot of these cruelties occurred in North America during the lifespans of many of my viewers. It's not as far away from the modern day as you might think.
Yeah, the late 1980s is wild. Like, them saying it's the 20s, I'm like, oh, yeah, that was a fucking long time ago. But, like, the 80s, yeah, I wasn't alive, but I'm like, okay, that's like your parents were alive.
Anyways, thank you very much for making it to the end. Since you're still here, why don't you
Buddy, I'll subscribe. Well, I'll subscribe, buddy. You don't need to ask me. That was a W video, though. That was fucking crazy to watch, though. All right. Chat, I gotta piss real quick, and I know I said it was gonna be my last